The HOA padlocked Evelyn's chicken coop in the heat, trapping her hens without warning or legal cause. Behind it all stood Ruth Martin, manipulative, calculating, and ready to break rules for a property deal. But Evelyn had something stronger than lawyers. A former student turned state agriculture inspector. Just wait until you see how the tables turned and how justice came clucking back. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Evelyn Brooks heard the unmistakable clang of metal locking shut. She looked up from her potting bench, wiping soil from her hands, confused by the noise coming from the corner of her yard. At first, she thought maybe a neighbor's kid was fooling around, or maybe a delivery guy had leaned something against the gate by mistake. But as she walked closer, the scene snapped into focus, and her breath caught in her throat. Two people in reflective vests stood at her chicken coop. One of them, Greg Lewis, the HOA's self-appointed compliance enforcer, was snapping a heavy-duty padlock through the coop door's hasp. Beside him was Ruth Martin, the board secretary, holding a clipboard like it was a judge's gavel. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were deliberately sealing her hens inside. Evelyn's heart pounded. "What are you doing?" she shouted, rushing forward. She didn't even have time to take off her gloves. Greg didn't even look at her. Ruth raised her chin and said flatly, "This structure is in violation of HOA Code 4, 3.2, unsanitary urban livestock conditions and unauthorized farm activity." The words hit like ice water. Inside the coop, her Rhode Island Reds flapped and clucked in distress, dust rising from their bedding. The water dispenser had been knocked over during the commotion, and the midday sun was creeping into the enclosure. It was already 82 degrees, and rising. "You are locking them inside?" Evelyn asked, stunned. "Without water? That's not just wrong, it's cruel. You can't do that." Greg shrugged and muttered something about neighborhood standards. Ruth just gave a tight, smug smile and said, "This isn't a barnyard, Mrs. Brooks. If you want to play farmer, buy a plot in the country. Read your HOA charter." But Evelyn had read it, line by line. She'd even kept a printed copy, highlighted and marked with sticky notes. There was no clause banning backyard hens, not even a mention of poultry. In fact, city regulations specifically allowed up to 6 hens per residential property under the local right to farm ordinance. She had followed every rule, filed every form. The coop had been built to code and approved 3 years ago. So this wasn't about health codes. It wasn't about safety or sanitation. It was personal. And standing there, staring at her terrified hens behind a locked gate, Evelyn felt a sharp, sickening twist of realization in her gut. The people in charge of her community had decided they didn't care about rules. They cared about control. And they were using her chickens as a weapon to break her. The padlock wasn't the beginning. It was just the final straw. For weeks, Evelyn had been brushing off little jabs from the HOA, typed letters on stiff white paper with language just polite enough to stay out of legal trouble. "Concerns have been raised. Some residents report disturbances. Please reconsider your choice of livestock." Livestock. As if her 6 hens were a herd of bison. She'd taken every letter seriously at first, responding with printed copies of her permits and even inviting a board member to visit the coop and see how well it was maintained. No one showed up. The next week, another letter came, this time citing pest attraction and property value impact. Then came Greg Lewis. He wore his sunglasses like armor and called himself the compliance director, even though that wasn't an actual title. At board meetings, he dropped comments that weren't quite threats, but landed just as heavy. "We're going to have to do something about those squawkers," he'd say, smirking from across the room. "People come here to get away from farm noise." Evelyn kept her head down. She didn't want trouble. She was retired, had taught biology for 30 years, and just wanted to tend her garden, read in peace, and let the kids from next door feed her hens through the fence like always. But then came the push from Ruth Martin. Ruth had always been the type who made suggestions sound like orders and turned every committee into a fiefdom. She'd invited Evelyn 3 separate times to join her aesthetic improvement subcommittee. Evelyn had politely declined each time explaining she valued biodiversity, native plants, and gardens that served pollinators and people, not just trimmed bushes and color-coordinated gravel. Ruth didn't like being told no, especially not by someone who, in her eyes, was letting her yard go wild. It all came into focus one afternoon when Evelyn bumped into a delivery man unloading furniture at the vacant unit behind her property. "Flipping it," he explained casually. "Realtor says they're trying to stage it for resale." "Realtor?" she asked around. Turns out Ruth's niece had bought the place 2 months ago. Now they were fixing it up to sell, fast, and Evelyn's property backed directly onto the backyard of that unit. A tidy, ornamental yard on Evelyn's side would help the sale. A coop full of clucking hens, even if legal and clean, didn't fit the brochure. They weren't just sending letters out of concern. They weren't trying to maintain standards. They were applying pressure. The passive-aggressive notes, the snide remarks, the sudden wave of noise complaints, the padlock. It was all part of a quiet campaign to get Evelyn to move, or at least give up the coop. Her chickens had become a symbol of resistance, of independence, of everything Ruth and Greg couldn't control. And for that, they were willing to lock animals in the heat and pretend it was compliance. They weren't enforcing the rules. They were rewriting them, and they had no idea who they were messing with. Evelyn spent that entire evening pacing the hallway of her home, her fingers still trembling with anger. She'd held it together when they padlocked her coop, kept her voice steady, didn't give Ruth or Greg the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. But once the sun went down and her hens were still locked in, the frustration boiled over. She could call a lawyer, sure, but those battles were long, expensive, and favored whoever could afford to drag it out. She'd seen neighbors get tangled up in years of HOA litigation, losing peace of mind even if they won. Then, in the middle of stirring her evening tea, something clicked. Carlos de Leon, she hadn't spoken to him in years, but he'd been one of her brightest students. Curious, compassionate, sharp as a tack. He'd gone on to study environmental sciences and worked his way up to a position with the state agriculture department. Last she heard, he was handling compliance issues across their region. She pulled out her phone and sent a simple message. "Carlos, it's Mrs. Brooks. I have a situation involving a locked chicken coop and an overreaching HOA. Call me when you can." The reply came within an hour. "Send me the address. I'll be there tomorrow morning." At exactly 9:30 the next morning, Evelyn opened her back gate to find Carlos standing there in a state-issued field vest, a clipboard in one hand and a badge clipped to the collar. He hadn't changed much, just older, more focused. But the smile he gave her was warm and familiar. "I read the local ordinances on my way here," he said, walking toward the coop. "Let's take a look." Carlos worked methodically. He checked the coop structure, the ventilation, the feed bins, even the type of grit she used in the bedding. He asked questions about how she managed waste and how often she rotated water. She answered each one clearly and with pride. When he reached the padlock, his mood shifted. "You said HOA members did this?" Evelyn nodded. "2 of them, no warning, no notice, just showed up and locked it shut." Carlos knelt by the latch, examining how it had been forced into the existing hasp. His eyes narrowed. "This is a state-recognized agricultural enclosure. These hens are documented under municipal code and protected by the Right to Farm Act. If someone outside of an authorized agency restricted animal access without cause or documentation, that's a violation, possibly more than one." He stood up, his voice lower now. "They tampered with a permitted animal facility. That's administrative obstruction. And if they knew animals were inside, could cross into animal endangerment?" Evelyn felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since the fight began. Hope. By noon the next day, Carlos was back, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 colleagues from the Department of Agriculture accompanied him, along with 2 state inspectors wearing field jackets and official credentials. They walked past the HOA clubhouse, clipboard first, without a word. Evelyn stayed at her kitchen window, hands curled tightly around her mug, watching. One of them took photographs of the coop, Another filmed as Carlos pointed out the lock. Within minutes, they had it cut, gently opened the gate, and made sure the hens were safe. The birds fluttered out, dazed but unharmed. Then came the notice. A bright orange cease and desist order was stapled right to the HOA clubhouse door, facing the street for all residents to see. The language was firm. The state was investigating interference with a licensed agricultural structure and unauthorized enforcement actions. Any further attempts would result in legal escalation. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn exhaled fully. Her coop was open, her hens were safe, and the people who thought they could push her around had just been publicly and officially told, "You crossed the line." The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within days of the cease and desist order, the state's formal citations arrived, one for obstruction of permitted agricultural activity and another for executing enforcement actions without legal authority. The language was blunt, the penalties real. The HOA board scrambled to minimize the damage, but the damage was already done. Greg Lewis, who had strutted around in his compliance director vest for nearly a year, was abruptly removed from all enforcement duties. No explanation was sent to residents, just a quiet note on the next meeting agenda, reassignment of committee roles. Ruth Martin kept her position on the board, but her influence cracked. Word had spread. Residents talked. Stories grew legs, and fast. The notion that someone would lock live animals in a coop for the sake of curb appeal didn't sit well with anyone, especially not in a neighborhood full of families and retirees who had known Evelyn for years. And Ruth's niece, the property she was flipping, the one directly behind Evelyn's lot, never sold. The staged lawn, the repainted shutters, the fancy patio furniture, all wasted. Potential buyers started asking about the incident with the chickens, and once they learned what happened, they walked. One young couple even said flat out, "We're not buying next to someone who tried to intimidate a neighbor for having a garden." The HOA board, under pressure from the city and its own embarrassed residents, issued a formal apology, written, signed, and read aloud at the next meeting. They acknowledged Evelyn's right to farm, recognized her permits, and stated clearly that no further interference would be tolerated. But Evelyn didn't show up to hear it. She was home, sitting on a weathered bench beside the coop, a book in her lap and a coffee by her side, while a group of neighborhood kids took turns tossing seed and giggling at the way the hens pecked and fluffed. She hadn't fought for praise. She hadn't fought to humiliate anyone. She'd fought for her animals, her peace, and her right to grow what she believed in. The coop stood a little taller now, refortified with a new steel mesh gate and a small motion sensor camera mounted discreetly above the frame. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Evelyn had seen what some people would do when they thought no one was watching. But she had also seen what happened when good people did watch, when they stood up, spoke out, and didn't back down. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the hens settled into their evening roost, Evelyn finally allowed herself a smile. Not the smile of revenge, but the kind that comes when peace is restored, and the right thing, finally, has been done. Her chickens, safe, well-fed, and clucking contentedly like none of it had ever happened. But Evelyn remembered, and so did the neighborhood.